Wherever you are, whether curled up beneath a thick blanket, lying still on a creaky mattress, or maybe listening with one ear open while the other rests against your pillow, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we travel back through time, not to explore kings and queens or tales of glory and war, but to visit the quiet, cold corners of history that are rarely told. This is the story of survival in its simplest form. A tale of dirt floors, frozen toes, smoky hearths, and the raw determination it took just to make it through the night. We begin in the Middle Ages. Not the glamorous medieval era you see in movies with shining armor and castle banquets. No, we're going far beneath the tapestries and torches, deep into the mud-streaked world of the everyday peasant. The ones who didn't have gold or power, but did have something much harder to measure: resilience. Their winters were long, their homes were humble, and their nights were brutally cold. So, before we begin, make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights, take a deep breath, and if you can, wrap yourself in something warm. Maybe a cup of tea, maybe a pillow to hug. We're not here for action or adventure, just a quiet journey through time, meant to help you unwind, settle your thoughts, and maybe, just maybe, drift gently into sleep. And if you find value in this peaceful trip through history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time your night begins. It's always a wonder seeing how far our sleepy little stories can travel. Now, imagine this. You're a medieval peasant. It's the heart of winter, and the sun has long since disappeared behind a horizon of skeletal trees and snow-muted fields. Your home? A one-room hut. The walls are made of wattle and daub, a polite term for twigs woven together and smeared with mud, straw, and animal dung. It's not pretty, and it's definitely not warm, but it's home. The wind howls outside like an angry spirit, sneaking its cold fingers through every crack it can find. You've stuffed the gaps with moss and old cloth, but the breeze still finds a way in. The roof above you is thatched, layers of straw now soggy and starting to sag from weeks of snow and rain. Occasionally, something small scampers across it, a mouse, or maybe a squirrel, or something you've learned not to think about. You sit by the hearth, not a fireplace, just a circle of stones and ash in the center of the room. There's a fire, but it's small, barely flickering. The wood is damp, or maybe it's not wood at all, just dried dung cakes, crumbling and smoky, filling the air with the thick scent of burned pasture. There's no chimney. The smoke curls upward, hesitant at first, then gathers beneath the ceiling before spilling out through a hole in the roof. It stings your eyes, makes your throat itch, but it's better than freezing. Your family is gathered around you. You're all dressed in every piece of clothing you own, layers of rough wool, patched tunics, a threadbare cloak that's still faintly of goat. You look like a bundle of laundry that came to life. The children curl up near the fire, limbs tangled, sharing heat. One of them is clutching a chicken for warmth. The goat? She's inside too. She's family now. Even the dog is here, curled into a tight spiral, nose tucked into tail. The floor beneath you is just dirt, cold, damp earth that never lets you forget it's winter. You've thrown down rushes, dried grass to make it feel like you're not directly lying on the ground, but the chill still seeps through. Up from the soles of your feet into your bones, whispering softly, "I am here, and I am not leaving." There are no windows, maybe just a tiny hole in the wall, covered with stretched animal hide that barely blocks the wind. The room is dim. The fire sputters again. A log shifts, ash stirs. Your breath forms clouds in the air. Indoors. Your bed, if you have one, it's a low wooden frame stuffed with straw. And that straw is not fresh. It's dusty, it crunches when you shift, and it's already shared with a family of fleas who have no intention of sleeping. You lie down beside your loved ones. The baby cries softly, cold. Your spouse pulls the wool blanket tighter. It's really more a rug than a blanket, but tonight it must be enough. Outside, the snow falls silently. The wind sighs through the cracks again. The fire gives one last defiant crackle and begins to die. And so, the night begins. The frozen floor and the flickering heart of the home. The cold wasn't just something that came from outside. In the homes of medieval peasants, the cold came from below, from the earth itself. Like a silent ghost rising through the straw, creeping up through your soles, whispering frost into your joints. If you dropped something on the floor overnight, well, congratulations. It was now part of the permafrost, gone, claimed, frozen into the ground like a tiny offering to the winter gods. To fight back, people tried all sorts of things. They laid down thick mats of straw. If you had enough, and if your neighbor didn't notice their pile getting smaller, maybe you could get a few layers between you and the icy dirt. But straw flattened fast. It got moldy, it got smelly, it turned into a crunchy, musty mess that still didn't do much against the deep chill seeping from below. Some people used rushes instead, long grasses dried and scattered across the floor. They didn't clean the old ones out, they just threw more on top, layer after layer. Over time, your flooring became a kind of living compost pile, filled with decomposing plants, wandering insects, and the occasional tiny mystery creature. Soft, yes. Sanitary, not so much. It was medieval carpet padding, if your carpet was slightly alive and smelled vaguely of old cabbage. Now imagine trying to sleep on that. Not a plush mattress, not a cozy bed frame, just a wooden slab or maybe a low frame stuffed with hay. You'd lie there, wrapped in wool, straw poking at your back, listening to the wind outside, trying not to move too much so you wouldn't wake the fleas. Tossing and turning wasn't a quest for comfort, it was survival. Each roll and shift was a desperate attempt to keep blood flowing, to avoid letting any part of your body go cold for too long. The back of your legs, freezing. Flip. Now your stomach's an ice tray. Flip again. Medieval bedtime aerobics. But through all this, through the dirt floors, the icy winds, the shared blankets that barely covered your feet, there was one thing that stood between you and the frozen night. The fire, the hearth, the sputtering, smoky miracle in the center of your home. It was no fireplace. There were no bricks, no chimney, no neat little mantelpiece where you could hang anything, let alone stockings. Just a pit in the floor or a circle of stones, blackened with soot, surrounded by coughing children and snoring livestock. The fire gave heat, barely. It gave light, just enough to see the rats avoiding your toes. And it gave smoke, lots and lots of smoke. Most peasant homes didn't have chimneys. That clever invention was for castles and cathedrals and other places that didn't smell like sheep droppings. In a peasant's home, the smoke drifted upward, slowly, lazily, filling the space like a fog bank until it either found its way out through the thatched roof or didn't. Some nights you'd sit there, blinking and wheezing, eyes red, coughing into your sleeve, wondering if you were turning into a ham. And in a way, you kind of were, gently smoked, slightly salted by the air, ready for the next winter famine. But the smoke had its upsides. It killed fleas, drove off lice, gave your home that authentic medieval musk. And more importantly, it meant the fire was still alive. Keeping that fire alive was a job for everyone. Children fetched peat or sticks. Adults kept watch, poking at embers, adjusting half-burnt logs, praying the wind wouldn't find its way in and snuff everything out. Because starting a fire from scratch was not a task anyone looked forward to. There were no matches, no lighters, just flint, steel, and desperation. A spark was rare. Kindling was scarce. Your fingers were frozen. So peasants did what they could. They learned to bank the fire. No, not savings, not coin. To bank the fire meant burying the glowing coals in ash before bed, hiding them like treasure.
The ash insulated them, kept the heat trapped in just enough to keep the embers alive. Come morning, you dig through the ashes with hopeful fingers, toss on some dried moss or sticks, and if the fire spirits were kind, it would blaze again. If not, well, back to the flint and prayers. Everyone had their own fire banking tricks. Some swore by dry ash. Others swore a bit of moisture helped the coals last longer. A few packed the ashes tight. Others fluffed them gently. You could start a village-wide argument over fire banking technique, and you'd be amazed how serious people got about it. After all, it wasn't just a hobby. It was the difference between...
Wind down, friend. Tonight, we drift gently back in time. Back to the forgotten corners of history, not the castles or the kings, but to the frost-covered fields and smoke-filled huts of those who truly bore the weight of winter, the medieval peasants. This isn't a tale of glory or conquest. It's about survival, about itchy wool tunics, smoky hearths, and sleeping beside your cow because that was warmer than sleeping alone. So before we begin, take a breath, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, comforting hum. If you enjoy quiet stories that help you fall asleep, feel free to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to know where this sleepy little campfire reaches. Now let's step into a colder world, one made of straw and smoke, where every winter night was a challenge and every morning was a quiet victory. From the dirt floor beneath your feet to the thatched roof above your head, the cold crept in from every direction. It wasn't the kind of cold that pinched, it settled. It settled into your bones, your bed, your very breath. And no matter how tightly you wrapped yourself, it found its way in, like a stubborn ghost determined to remind you that winter was never far away. If you dropped anything onto the floor during the night, congratulations, it now belonged to the frost. The earthen floor wasn't just cold, it was a silent enemy that slowly worked its way upward. A creeping, invisible threat that turned homes into ice boxes with livestock and children packed like sardines. Peasants tried to fight back with what little they had. Some homes layered straw thick across the floor, a golden sea of crunch and dust meant to keep the cold from rising. But straw flattened fast, it molded faster, and it always carried an orchestra of fleas, dampness, and that unmistakable earthy scent, like a barn, only less cheerful. Others used rushes, long grasses bundled and tossed over the floor like poor man's carpet. These were rarely cleaned out. Instead, fresh rushes were thrown on top of old ones, layering into a living compost heap. By springtime, the floor beneath your bed might contain months of plant decay, mystery bugs, and who knows what else. You slept over it like royalty, if royalty also had rats. Beds were no relief either. If you were lucky, you had a wooden frame with a sack stuffed full of hay. If not, you slept straight on the rushes. No quilts, no pillows, just the occasional goat for company. The nights were long, and sleep wasn't about dreams. It was about survival. It was about keeping your limbs moving just enough to avoid waking up with frostbitten fingers or the terrifying realization that you couldn't feel your toes. But amid all the discomfort, there was one thing, a flickering hope, the hearth. Not a fireplace as we imagine it, no elegant stonework or chimney for the smoke to escape. Just a pit in the center of the room, surrounded by soot-covered stones and guarded like a sacred altar. Smoke drifted lazily up into the rafters, or into your face. Most peasants didn't have chimneys, so the house simply marinated in the fumes. It was hard to breathe, but on the bright side, it did help kill off the fleas. The fire served every purpose. It was the kitchen, the nightlight, the heater, and the only entertainment in town.
Families gathered around it, whispering stories, sharing scraps of bread, or simply staring into the embers as the wind howled outside. Keeping it burning through the night wasn't just tradition, it was a matter of life and death. Letting the fire die meant inviting the cold in like a hungry wolf. And relighting it wasn't as simple as striking a match. You had flint, steel, a sliver of hope, and fingers already too cold to move. So peasants banked the fire, not in gold, but in ash. At night, the last person awake would cover the glowing coals in a soft layer of ash, insulating them so they smoldered quietly until morning. If you did it right, you woke up to a warm breath of fire. If you did it wrong, well, you spent the morning apologizing to your shivering family while trying not to cry into a frozen bucket of water. And everyone had an opinion on how to bank a fire correctly. Dry ash, damp ash, pack it tight, leave it loose. Medieval fire.
Hoped you didn't lose a toe. And oh, don't even think about washing all those layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter? That was an adventure all on its own. Imagine dragging your frozen, shivering self through snowdrifts to the nearest stream, only to find it locked beneath a thick sheet of ice. So you'd smash through that frozen barrier with water ice cold enough to freeze your breath midair, and then dunk your one and only shirt into the stream. Then the real challenge began, waiting 2 agonizing days for that poor garment to dry. Or, more often than not, just watching it freeze solid into what could only be described as a tragic shirt-shaped block of ice. You could hang it by the fire all you wanted, but winter didn't care about your laundry woes. So, most peasants, wise beyond their frost-bitten toes, decided smelling like a curious blend of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not turning into human popsicles. But here's the kicker. All that dirt and grease buildup had a surprising bonus feature. That grimy layer, it locked in precious body heat like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just a lot smellier and way less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were like treasure chests of warmth. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with your hair literally frozen stiff against the wall. Gloves, often homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric could be scavenged, sometimes looking less like protective gear and more like sad little puppet costumes. Children were swaddled so thoroughly they resembled overstuffed turnips waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal? Trap as much of that precious body heat as possible. Style and elegance? Never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex. So, the next time you're grumbling about layering up for a chilly day, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobes at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags and feeling pretty lucky for it. Now, in the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off, it was practically a survival tool. Getting grimy wasn't a sign you'd given up on life. It was tactical, strategic, dare I say, genius. Winter posed a very specific problem: heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. Sure, they were breathable, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in. As peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armor clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes far more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just way smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat who'd lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions, like when the bishop showed up or maybe right before you died.
Adding to this strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You simply threw your new layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks, every stain telling the heroic story of that one time you slipped in the mud but didn't die. To outsiders, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they'd completely given up on hygiene, but the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It was function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were winning at life. And if you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic. By rustic, I mean let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds in the medieval peasant world were usually a rough wooden frame, if you were lucky enough to have one, covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That was it. No memory foam, orthopedic support, no 5-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret.
You live in a house made of sticks, mud, and optimism. That's right, optimism was basically the only thing holding these walls together. Because winter breezes, they weren't just annoying nuisances, they were personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold outside, they battled it inside their own homes. And their weapons? Whatever they could cram into the countless cracks and crevices. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. Cold found new ways to sneak in every night, like some mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up a house in winter became an art form. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was jammed into a hole somewhere. Some particularly determined souls even slathered extra layers of mud and dung over the outside walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing out there in freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine, this is luxury." And in a way, it really was. Roof leaks? Another battlefield. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and snow. Peasants plugged holes in their roofs with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Every home eventually started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt, stitched together by someone who gave up halfway through. Doors and windows, if you were lucky enough to have them, were little more than wood planks hung by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Windows often had holes covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block drafts and add a bonus aroma of mystery meat to the living space. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and the relentless sneaky cold. One minute you'd be warm, the next a sudden gust would find that one spot you missed, slapping you awake like the frosty hand of doom. Yet somehow, through cleverness, stubbornness, and a refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent state of being, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the worst winters nature could throw at them, one muddy handful at a time. When the cold bit hard enough to keep you awake at night, peasants had a solution. Don't even try to pretend everyone's sleeping at once. Instead, they developed a survival strategy that would make any modern military commander proud: sleeping in shifts. It wasn't some grand organized system with whistles and roll calls. It was far simpler and much more desperate. Half the household stayed awake, tending the fire and patching stray drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep.
The fire needed constant attention. Left alone, it would die down, and restarting it about as easy as convincing a stubborn donkey to dance. So someone always had to be on Ember Patrol. Since no one wanted to get up once they were finally warmish, families rotated shifts. You doze for a few hours, get elbowed awake, then stumble over to the hearth to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life, all while trying not to step on the goat. The rotation wasn't glamorous. No late-night snacks, and certainly no 5 more minute snooze buttons. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and growing resentment toward whoever snored loudest during your shift. Children old enough to hold a stick were pressed as a service early, learning that in winter, everyone pulled their weight or froze. Grandparents sometimes stayed by the fire longer, both for their experience and because arthritis made lying down and getting up again a monumental event. And when it was your turn to sleep, good luck. People moving about, animals rustling, wind battering the walls, and the occasional sharp nudge from a sibling who rolled over too hard. Getting quality rest was a miracle. Yet, despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Sleeping in shifts meant there were always eyes and cold, begrudging hands ready to keep the hearth alive. The ember survived, and by extension, so did the family. So next time you grumble about waking up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoking fire at 3 a.m., wondering if toes were really that important after all. You know it's cold when you have to think about how you breathe just to stay alive. Medieval peasants didn't just battle freezing air with cloaks, fires, and creative sleeping arrangements, they even adjusted the way they inhaled and exhaled to survive the night. The problem was simple. Deep, open-mouth breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs.
A warmer barrier, of course. This also meant you ended up with a damp, slightly soggy fabric patch clinging to your mouth by morning. But hey, anything that kept you from freezing from the inside out was worth it. Children were taught these breathing tricks early on. Parents would scold little ones for panting like dogs indoors during the cold months. And honestly, between strict breathing lessons, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood winters were character building on a whole different level. At night, tucked into straw bedding under piles of cloaks and next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became an art form. Slow, steady, nose only, and as minimal as humanly possible. Like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, only with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. In the grand survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants endured another night in the long, relentless war against winter. In this endless battle, peasants discovered an unlikely secret weapon, a full stomach. Turns out, one of the best ways to fight off the cold wasn't another scratchy wool cloak. It was stuffing yourself with something hearty and heavy right before bed. Calories meant warmth. The more your body had to digest, the more it heated itself up, doing the work. It's basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate internal heat, and maybe, just maybe, survive until morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So, what did peasants pile onto their plates before a long freezing night? Think thick stews, heavy with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains were lifesavers too. Oat porridge, barley gruel, or dense, chewy rye bread. If you were especially lucky, say after a festival day or a generous slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork or a slice of dried sausage thrown into the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. No delicate presentation, no artisanal garnishes. It was one enormous, vaguely brown meal designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the night and keeping you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot. It was about eating smart foods that took longer to digest and provided a slow, steady trickle of warmth. Fatty foods were particularly praised, not just for the energy they provided, but because fat burned slower than lean meat.
A belly full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard? Peak medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate heartily. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed the turnips. Harsh but effective parenting, medieval style. Of course, heavy nighttime eating came with its own hazards. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of vivid, bizarre dreams, fueled by a stomach trying desperately to process an entire field's worth of cabbages. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for a Michelin star meal. They were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed full, bloated, and breathing gently through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the ongoing quest to see another frosty sunrise. Long before electric blankets and fancy heated mattress pads, medieval peasants had to get creative if they wanted a little extra warmth at bedtime. And that's how the humble hay box and the ever-glamorous heated stone became winter's unsung heroes. Let's start with the hay box. It sounds rustic, and it absolutely was, but the idea was pure genius. Peasants would take a sturdy wooden box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier, keeping it warm for hours. Leftover stew, hot porridge, toss it into the hay box, cover it up, and it stayed hot enough for a late-night snack without needing to risk reigniting the fire. Medieval slow cookers, basically. But peasants didn't just stop at food. They realized if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could also trap the heat from something even better, rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the family argument, would grab a flat stone and chuck it into the hearth fire. After roasting it until it was nearly too hot to touch, a fine line between helpful and third-degree burn, they'd fish it out using a stick or some old tongs. The stone, still radiating blissful warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth, or jammed into a clay pot, then slipped under the hay in the mattress or down at the foot of the bed. A medieval heating pad, ready to do battle against the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks.
Less about personal preference and more about strategic positioning. Infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail got first dibs on prime real estate by the fire. Parents, older kids, and sturdier adults fanned out from there like human insulation layers. Being assigned a spot close to the fire wasn't just kindness, it was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge, and, let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with prime warmth was non-negotiable. But it wasn't all cozy toasting by the flames. Too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smoldering suspiciously. Too far, and you were basically camping in an icebox. It was a delicate dance. Stay near enough to bask in the fire's glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbor why you now looked like a half-cooked roast. The fire also didn't spread warmth evenly. It mostly roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat like cold lizards jostling for a sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side and one side frozen so solid you could probably knock on it. Pets and livestock muscled in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, tail wagging dangerously close to open flame. Chickens sometimes perched perilously on hearthstones, clucking softly into the night like tiny feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of glowing embers was a tiny promise. You're still alive. You're still warm, for now. And so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. In the medieval world, no one survived winter alone unless they wanted to become a very stylish frozen statue by January.
Survival wasn't just a family affair. It was a village project, a messy, muddy, loud collaboration where everyone's warmth and life depended on everyone else. The peasants knew that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much. If your neighbor's house went dark, you noticed. If the smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped curling into the sky, someone went to check. Not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might have been part of it, but because community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the elderly who couldn't work the fields but could keep an eye on who was coughing too hard, who hadn't come to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a little too still in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighborhood patrol, minus the reflective vests, plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A good neighbor would rush over with a glowing coal bundled in rags, or, better yet, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing an extra 4 bodies into an already cramped space, but it was better than finding frozen friends come spring. Communal food stores played a role too. During especially brutal winters, villages sometimes pulled from their last salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables. It was grim charity, no one had much, but a few communal meals could be the difference between staggering into spring or not staggering at all. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened, disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose good cooking pot never really went away. But when the nights grew deadly cold, old grudges were often quietly shelved. After all, a rival was still worth saving because tomorrow it might be you needing rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village became one big, stubborn family, sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, always fiercely determined to survive together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. When medieval peasants faced the merciless cold of winter, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed. A lot. Because when the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fire shrank into sullen embers, you wanted every possible advantage, including a little divine intervention. Faith wasn't just a Sunday affair back then. It was woven into every frozen breath before crawling under layers of straw.
Through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some abstract comfort. It was a daily, urgent conversation. The peasants weren't asking for luxury, just survival. A little heat, a little food, and one more day to muddle through until spring broke the frozen grip on their tiny villages. It was simple, raw hope, whispered into the smoky rafters, tangled in breathless prayers, and tucked under itchy blankets. That fragile hope somehow carried them through the endless, merciless nights of winter. For all the ingenuity, prayers, and stubbornness medieval peasants threw at winter, the truth was chilling. Sometimes it wasn't enough. And when winter won, it didn't just take a few unlucky souls. It took entire families, whole villages, vanishing them into silence beneath a heavy shroud of snow and ice. Some winters were particularly cruel, like the infamous Great Famine winter of 1315, when relentless rains destroyed crops, livestock starved, and freezing temperatures turned an already brutal existence into a slow, grinding disaster. People were so desperate that stories whispered of eating shoe leather, bark, and in the most horrifying cases, each other. Failure to keep the fire alive wasn't just an inconvenience, it was often a death sentence. Without the hearth's meager warmth, families huddled together for the final time. Neighbors would sometimes stumble across whole households in spring, bodies still locked in one another's frozen embrace,
as if trying to share just a little more heat until the very end. Houses themselves could collapse under the weight of heavy snow or battering ice storms. A roof giving way in the middle of a frozen night wasn't just catastrophic, it was often fatal. Dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg shelter from neighbors wasn't a guarantee either, especially if those neighbors were already stretched to the breaking point. Disease loved the cold too. Starvation weakened the body, and cramped, smoky homes turned into breeding grounds for pneumonia, bronchitis, and other deadly infections. A simple cough in December could easily be a funeral by January. And then there was the quiet horror, frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears blackened and died while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived winters at the cost of their limbs, a grim badge of honor that said, "I made it through, but winter took a piece of me." Yet what's most haunting isn't just the death, it's the eerie normalcy of it. People accepted that each winter some among them wouldn't see the thaw. Death wasn't unexpected. It was just another neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, waiting its turn. Even amid the bitter cold and constant threat, medieval peasants pressed on, stubborn, grieving, clinging to life. Because as long as there was one ember left in the hearth, one breath hanging in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. When we look back at medieval peasants, the muddy, frost-bitten survivors of endless winters, it's tempting to see only their hardships, the cracked hands, the frozen toes, the smoke-choked huts. But buried beneath all that struggle is something far more powerful, a legacy of raw, stubborn ingenuity and unbreakable endurance. They didn't have central heating, thermal jackets, or cozy memory foam mattresses. They didn't even have the luxury of assuming they'd survive until spring. But what they did have, and what they left behind, was the blueprint for resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every hand-banked fire, every moss-crammed wall gap was a testament to human creativity under pressure. Faced with impossible odds, they didn't collapse in despair. They adapted. They learned from the land, from each other, and from the bitter lessons carved by each brutal winter. Their communities were built on more than shared land. They were built on shared survival. They taught each other to watch over the sick, to pull resources when food ran low, to trust that helping a freezing neighbor today might help you tomorrow. They lived by the understanding that no one beats winter alone. Their faith, too, was a kind of endurance. They wove prayers into their daily lives, not just out of fear, but out of hope. Fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter. Hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would come again, and life would find a way to push through the frozen ground. And somehow, it did. Because of their
Queen in a Storm, Anne Boleyn's rise and the birth of a New England. After nearly 7 agonizing years of whispers, promises, diplomatic uproars, and theological gymnastics, Anne Boleyn's gamble finally bore fruit. In a secret ceremony likely held in a quiet chapel far from the eyes of disapproving nobles and trembling clergy, Anne married Henry VIII in January 1533. The ink was barely dry on the annulment papers, still contested by Rome, when she was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey that summer. But this was no ordinary coronation. Anne's elevation was a public proclamation, a defiant roar across England and Europe that the old world had been cast aside. She was not merely the king's new wife, she was the symbol of an entirely new order. Gone was the obedient silence expected of women at court. Gone were the days when papal blessings sanctified the crown. With Anne on the throne, Henry declared that England answered to no power but its own. The break with Rome had begun. And Anne? Anne stood at the very heart of this thunderous transformation.
Despite her crown, her velvet robes, and her newly gilded court, Anne Boleyn did not walk into peace. Her queenship was built not on consensus, but on rebellion. The people, many of whom adored Queen Catherine, watched her procession in cold silence. Women turned their faces away. Some refused to cheer. The gossip in taverns and parishes called her the concubine, whispered that her dark eyes bewitched the king, that she had climbed to the throne on ambition and sin. Anne knew, and she smiled anyway, because Anne Boleyn was not made for quiet acceptance. She had studied the great queens of Europe, the ones who ruled not just with beauty, but with wit, faith, and fire. She transformed her court into a center of elegance and learning, surrounding herself with poets, scholars, musicians, and reformers. Latin verses mingled with reformist sermons. Her ladies-in-waiting were chosen for both their charm and their cleverness. Gone was the dutiful, pious mood of Catherine's court. In its place was a bright, sharp, electric court of ideas and elegance. Anne herself supported the rise of Protestant thinkers, quietly passing banned books in gilded sleeves and embroidered prayer books. She was not content to be a silent consort. She was a queen of vision, a partner to the king not only in marriage, but in revolution. It was under her influence that the English Reformation gained steam. Her voice, unofficial and unofficially feared, echoed in the bold decisions of Henry's new Church of England. But all this brilliance hung by a single thread. Anne's survival and her power depended on her delivering what every Tudor wife was ultimately judged by, a son. In September 1533, Anne went into labor, and the court held its collective breath. If she bore a healthy male heir, her legacy would be secure. Her enemies would be silenced. Her crown would be untouchable. She gave birth to a girl. The child, wrapped in swaddling cloths embroidered with the Tudor rose, was named Elizabeth. It was a bitter irony. A child destined to become one of the greatest monarchs in history had been born into a world that judged her and her mother a disappointment. To Anne's credit, she did not retreat. She loved her daughter fiercely. She believed, perhaps more than Henry himself, that Elizabeth was destined for greatness. But outside the nursery, her grip on power began to fray. The court, always restless, sensed blood in the water. Courtiers whispered that Anne had lost the king's favor. Catherine's loyalists, long held in check, began to stir. Henry himself, always mercurial, grew distant. Anne had been the bright, burning star, but even stars begin to flicker under pressure. Still, Anne thought. She threw herself into another pregnancy, and then another. But each one ended in tragedy, miscarriages that left her body weak and her position weaker. Her sharp wit, once captivating, now cut too deep. Her political allies began to dwindle. Her enemies grew bold, circling like vultures. And then came Jane Seymour, quiet, modest, and obedient. Everything Anne was not. Everything Henry now wanted. The clock was ticking. Anne had rewritten the rules of power, shattered a queen, and altered the religious fate of a nation. But without a son, her enemies argued, her reign was built on sand. And Henry, ever impatient,
When the verdict was read, Anne Boleyn did not scream. She did not collapse. She did not beg. Instead, she stood, tall, composed, regal to the end. The same composure that had once captivated a king now served her in her final days. She had been judged guilty, not just of crimes, but of ambition, of brilliance, of daring to play a game designed by men and ruled by kings. But Anne knew what many in that courtroom feared to admit. This was never about justice. It was about erasure. And so, Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, was sentenced to die. She was taken back to her chambers within the Tower of London.
Not the grim prison of damp stone and iron shackles that housed common criminals, but the royal lodgings built for queens. And yet their splendor was meaningless now. The tapestries whispered of her past triumphs, but the shadows stretched longer with every passing hour. For 17 days she waited. 17 days of quiet horror. 17 days of praying, weeping, composing herself, and, at times, laughing. Yes, laughing, because Anne Boleyn, even facing death, refused to give her enemies the satisfaction of watching her break. Eyewitnesses later said she spoke with grace, held herself like a queen, and even joked about the skill of the swordsman who would execute her. She was told she would not face the axe. A French swordsman had been summoned, a blade so sharp it would end her life in a single, swift stroke. It was a strange mercy from Henry, the man who had once torn kingdoms apart for her smile and now arranged her death with clinical detachment. Outside the tower, preparations began. A scaffold was erected on the north side of the tower green. Boards laid, straw scattered to soak the blood. Noble spectators prepared to watch, not out of cruelty, but out of duty. The execution of a queen was not just a punishment, it was a moment of national reckoning. And then came May 19th, 1536. A cool morning, the sky heavy with clouds. Anne dressed carefully in a simple gray gown trimmed with fur, her dark hair covered by a white linen coif. Around her neck, no jewels, only the thin column of skin where the blade would fall. She walked calmly, supported by 2 women. No sobbing, no defiance, no hysteria. Just silence and the soft shuffle of slippers across the wooden scaffold. The crowd was still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Anne turned to the watching faces, some sympathetic, some cold, and spoke. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. According to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die. But they shall have no more to do with my case. I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you." She did not protest her innocence. She did not accuse her accusers. She ended her brief speech with a prayer for Henry, the man who had loved her, crowned her, and now destroyed her. Perhaps it was political wisdom. Perhaps it was forgiveness. Or perhaps it was the last brilliant move of a woman who had always understood power better than anyone around her. She knelt. Her ladies helped her tuck her skirts beneath her knees. One tied a blindfold around her eyes. She knelt in silence, still, poised, waiting for the sword. The French executioner, trained for swiftness, had hidden the blade behind his back. He called for his assistant to hand him the sword, a distraction, so that Anne would not tense. And in that moment of confusion, in that breath of stillness, he struck. A single stroke, and it was done. Anne Boleyn was dead. The crowd exhaled. The kingdom turned its gaze elsewhere. And within days, Henry VIII was betrothed to Jane Seymour. The woman for whom he had split from Rome, created a new church, defied emperors, and rewritten the order of the world, was gone. Buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, just feet from where she fell. No state funeral, no mourning veil, no national prayer. But Anne Boleyn did not vanish. Not truly. Though her body was hidden, her legacy refused to be buried. She left behind a daughter, Elizabeth, whom many dismissed as another failed hope. But that girl, born of scandal,
The night the tea sank, a harbor steeped in revolution. The night air in Boston on December 16, 1773, was bitter, sharp as broken glass, and still as judgment. The moon hung pale over Griffin's Wharf, casting long shadows that pooled like ink between warehouses and creaking piers. The streets, which had throbbed with passion and fire all day, now held their breath, waiting. Inside homes, candles flickered low. Mothers hushed children to sleep while husbands sat by the window, hands folded tightly, listening. Something was coming. You could feel it in the bones of the city, in the wind scraping down from the harbor, in the uneasy silence where laughter had lived just hours before. And then, from the alleys and the darkness, they emerged. Not soldiers, not statesmen, just men. Rough coats pulled tight against the cold, faces blackened with soot. Some wore feathers tied with scraps of leather. Others draped coarse blankets over their shoulders. They were not hiding their identities behind these crude costumes. They were shedding them. This was not the usual Boston. This was not the colony that begged and petitioned, that wrote letters to Parliament and hoped for crumbs of compromise. That Boston had died somewhere between the Stamp Act and the blood spilled during the Boston Massacre. Tonight, a new Boston walked the cobblestones. They moved in silence, gathering in small knots at first, then growing into a tide. Carpenters, blacksmiths, dockhands, teachers, ordinary men, carrying extraordinary purpose. No banners waved, no trumpets called, no commands were shouted, only the rhythmic beat of boots and determination. Their destination stood still in the water. 3 merchant ships anchored calmly in the dark harbor, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Their hulls heavy with over 340 chests of British East India Company tea, stacked neatly in their holds, waiting to be claimed or resisted. These were not warships. They carried no threat of muskets or cannon, and yet they represented something far more dangerous. Submission, acceptance, a final surrender of a principle the colonies could not afford to lose. If the tea was unloaded, even one chest, the tax would be paid. And if the tax was paid, then all the speeches, the marches, the blood, the sacrifice would mean nothing. The chain of Parliament's control would be reforged, tighter than before. They would not let that happen. At Griffin's Wharf, under the half-watching moon, the group split into teams and boarded the ships swiftly. They encountered little resistance. Only a handful of crew members remained on each vessel, wide-eyed but unharmed. This was not a night of violence. No blades were drawn, no fists raised, only firm hands and silent nods. This was not anarchy. This was resolve. With methodical precision, the men located the tea crates, massive wooden chests, nailed shut, stamped with the mark of empire. They pried them open with crowbars, hatchets, mallets. The scent of black tea filled the cold night air, rich, exotic, bitter. Then, one by one, the chests were lifted and carried to the rail. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just the splash, the heavy, satisfying crash of rebellion as crate after crate was thrown into the freezing Atlantic. Crack, crash, splash. Over and over. The sound echoed off the stone buildings and out over the silent city, like a drumbeat. Crack, crash, splash. Over 92,000 pounds of tea, enough to make more than 18 million cups, gone. The harbor began to turn black with it, leaves and slivers floating like soggy corpses beneath the surface. It looked like oil. It smelled like defiance. And still, the men worked. For hours, in the cold, in the dark, relentless. Not a single chest was stolen. Not a drop was saved. Not a man turned back. They swept the decks clean before they left, as if they'd never been there.
but everyone in Boston knew what had happened. The next morning, the city awoke not to cannon fire, nor to sermons or laws, but to silence, pierced by
The night the harbor turned black. They were pushed aside, crew members stunned and silent as shadows moved with purpose across the decks. There was no chaos, no shouting, just the sound of boots on wood and the sharp, practiced crack of hatchets splitting open the chests. The smell came first, a sharp, fragrant wave of fresh-cut tea leaves that clashed with the salty breath of Boston Harbor. Then came the splashes, one after another, heavy, deliberate. Crates, 342 in all, heaved overboard with steady hands. They struck the water like distant war drums. Boom, boom, boom. Each one a message. The black waters began to churn and swirl, the surface rippling with a storm of torn wood and blooming tea leaves. Thousands of pounds soaked into the icy current, dyeing the sea like ink in a teacup. The harbor, under the moon's pale watch, transformed into a vast brewing kettle. Onlookers, spectators from the dock, British sentries frozen in place, watched without moving. Perhaps in awe, perhaps in fear, perhaps understanding, in some part of them, that this night marked a line crossed. No one stopped them. The discipline was eerie. No looting, no fires, no stolen silver or scattered cargo. The ships were left intact, not a window broken, not a nail touched that did not hold tea. This wasn't a riot, it was ritual. In a city where poverty and hunger pressed in like winter winds, the tea, precious and plentiful, could have fed black markets for weeks. But no one took even a pinch. Because this night was not about profit, it was about principle. The symbol had to drown. And so, when it was done, the men vanished just as they came, wordless, faceless, into the alleys and lantern-lit fog. No names offered, no laurels claimed, only silence and soaked planks behind them. Morning came slow and bitter, the sun rising over a harbor thick with floating leaves. The smell was everywhere, salt and tea, rebellion and ruin. Boston had awoken to a different world. Word spread with wildfire speed. Shopkeepers whispered it to their customers. Children heard it in the streets before breakfast. Letters flew on horseback. By midday, every soul in Boston knew what had happened. And beyond Boston, the news galloped into towns and taverns across the colonies. Among patriots, it was pride. Fierce, swelling pride that men of no high office, no royal favor, had struck a blow against the mightiest empire on earth and gotten away with it. Among loyalists and moderates, horror, fear, the creeping dread that perhaps this had gone too far, that something precious, some bridge to peace, to reconciliation, had been burned. Governor Hutchinson was livid. The crown had been mocked, its property destroyed, its authority made a laughingstock. And the message was unmistakable. Boston would not bend. The captains of the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver could only stand helplessly, watching their fortune disappear beneath dark waters. Ledgers would mark the loss at over 10,000 pounds, a staggering sum. But it was never about the money. The true loss could not be counted in pounds or pence. It was trust. It was the last brittle thread between colony and crown snapping in the cold. And far beyond the waters of Boston, in the halls of Parliament and the drawing rooms of London, the echo had already begun to ring. Faint, distant, like thunder rolling toward the shore. The age of peaceful protest was over. Together, what had once been a Massachusetts problem was becoming something far larger, no longer local, no longer containable. In punishing Boston, the British had aimed to make an example of defiance. Instead, they forged a symbol. Boston became a rallying cry. The flames of rebellion, once flickering dimly in backrooms and barnyards, now leapt from colony to colony, from the smoky taverns of Virginia to the candlelit churches of Connecticut, from coastal Carolina to rugged New Hampshire hills. The spark had caught, and there would be no easy extinguishing it. The punishment that fell on Boston sent tremors far beyond its cobbled streets and shuttered port. What Parliament hoped would divide and discipline only united and awakened. Outrage was no longer emotion, it was motion, a rolling, rising current. For years, the colonies had acted like distant cousins, separated by forests and faith, accents and ambitions. They quarreled over borders. They competed for trade. They rarely agreed on much of anything. But now, something changed. Because when Parliament slammed Boston's harbor shut, when they stripped Massachusetts of its voice and its laws, Americans everywhere realized a terrifying truth. If it could happen to Boston, it could happen to anyone. And so, wagons rumbled down dusty roads from Pennsylvania farms and Virginia plantations, loaded not with anger, but with bread and flour, pork and grain. Help for Boston. Letters of support arrived by the sackful. In town squares, children read them aloud to crowds with tears in their eyes. Across the colonies, the people stirred. Printers inked through the night, spreading word and warning. Blacksmiths pounded iron, not just for horseshoes, but for weapons. In the quiet corners of America, rebellion was beginning to organize. And then, in September 1774, something truly unprecedented happened. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. 12 colonies, 1 table. Men who had once only known each other by rumor or reputation now stood shoulder to shoulder. George Washington of Virginia, John Adams of Massachusetts, Patrick Henry of Give Me Liberty fame, Samuel Adams, the firebrand of Boston. They gathered not as subjects of a distant king, but as stewards of a common cause. Officially, they sought peace, reconciliation with the crown, respect, restoration. But behind the civil language and careful diplomacy, something deeper took hold. A quiet understanding that the world had already changed, that the colonies could no longer afford to stand alone. Together, they declared an economic boycott of British goods. They pledged mutual defense, and they wrote plainly, an attack on one colony would be treated as an attack on all. In the taverns and meeting houses, in fields and church pews, new words rose like hymns. Unity, resistance, liberty. What Britain had meant as a warning had become a call. What was meant to suppress had only galvanized. And what was meant to isolate Boston had instead stitched a nation together, thread by thread, soul by soul. The hammer had fallen, but instead of fear, it had forged something harder than iron, resolve. The colonies, once scattered provinces, were becoming something dangerously new. Not subjects, not rebels, but Americans. And though they did not know it yet, though they could not yet see the long winters, the bloody fields ahead, they could feel it. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It had begun.